The antebellum time period, the time period immediately before the Civil War, was a time of many different and varying reform movements. However, the most important of the reform movements was abolition. But one must remember that there was no knowledge of that in the 1830s and 1840s. There was no knowledge that abolition would be successful, that Abraham Lincoln would be president, that Harriet Beecher Stowe would write Uncle Tom's Cabin. None of that was known. But since abolition was successful, we have to create a question through which we can order our thinking and through which we can put all of the facts that deal with abolition into a complex and sophisticated question that will allow us to think in complex and sophisticated ways. So the question is, was the eventual freeing of all slaves more a result of the actions of individuals and groups, such as Nat Turner, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Harriet Tubman, or was it a result of actions of the federal government, such as the Emancipation Proclamation, the ratification of the 13th Amendments? And those federal actions do include the decisions of the Supreme Court. To start at the beginning of the abolitionist movement, we go to the American Colonization Society, created in 1816. This was to free all slaves. However, there was also a stipulation in the United States that the slaves should be sent back to Africa. Indeed, during the presidency of James Monroe, a new country was created called Liberia, with its capital, of course, Monrovia, after James Monroe, with the idea that this would be a country made up of expatriate American slaves, slaves who were freed and sent back to Africa. Among the many problems with this concept is the whole idea of back to Africa. How could you go back to a place that you had never been to? How could you go back to a place that your ancestor had been forced to leave, to leave involuntarily, perhaps generations ago, or perhaps centuries ago? So in the early 19th century, there are really some very different views on abolition. To the left here is a coin of the new country of Liberia in the 1830s, with a ship in the background and someone planting and growing a tree in Liberia, and this is the colonization model. Slaves should be freed gradually or eventually, but they can't stay in the United States. They should go back to Africa, with a more egalitarian view of, am I not a man and a brother? Here's a common pamphlet put out by the American Colonization Societies, again with the idea that the former slaves would need to go back to Africa. And we'll come back to abolition before the Civil War, but let's spin this whole back to Africa segregation idea forward just a little bit. Here you see two pictures of Marcus Garvey, a prominent American colonization or back to Africa proponent, someone in favor of it, in the early 20th century. Now this is the picture one often sees in textbooks or illustrations. I'm not really fond of that. It makes Marcus Garvey look more than a little quirky. Now, he chose his clothes, but it almost is a buffoonery kind of thing. Whereas here's another picture of a young Marcus Garvey, and this picture really stands in stark contrast to how he is typically portrayed. Marcus Garvey was a businessman of some sorts, owning the Black Star Line that moved both goods and eventually was to form African Americans back to Africa. There were some questions about the ethics, perhaps even legality of his business dealings. Incidentally, one of the smaller effects that Marcus Garvey had is that there was a man that worked for him named Little, and the man's son's name was Malcolm. So young Malcolm grew up in a very black segregationist household. Now, Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement, segregation by continent, is not at all successful, but it is passed on to future generations. Young Malcolm Little's dad, who was a recruiter for Marcus Garvey, will later join the Nation of Islam and change his name to Malcolm X. Malcolm X will become a black segregationist, but not internationalist. That is, not back to Africa, not colonized, but really will suggest segregation by the races within the country. As he said, "I've never seen a sincere white man, not when it comes to helping black people. Usually things like this are done by white people to benefit themselves. The white man's primary interest is not to elevate the thinking of black people, or to awaken black people, or white people either. The white man is interested in the black man only to the extent that the black man is of use to him. The white man's interest is to make money, to exploit." Continuing, Malcolm X, the black segregationist, says, "I can't turn around without hearing about some civil rights advance. White people seem to think that the black man ought to be shouting, 'Hallelujah!' 400 years the white man has had his foot-long knife in the black man's back. And now the white man starts to wiggle the knife out maybe 6 inches? The black man's supposed to be grateful? Why, if the white man jerked the knife out, it's still going to leave a scar." Without going further into the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, we should remember that these are the views of Malcolm X previous to him making his Hajj, previous to him making his pilgrimage to Mecca. And he does come back from Mecca a very different person. But we can see how the black segregationists of Back to Africa and the American Colonization Society does go on forward. We'll stop there and go to and leave the rest of abolition for another screencast.